this lesson. We're talking about the knowing God better through encountering His glory, through the glory of God. And I'll do my usual introduction as we get going, because as we think about knowing the Father better, I want us to start with the same verse we've always started with, 1 Chronicles 28, verse 9. If you seek Him, He will be found by you. We get to know someone better when we personally interact with them, not just once, but regularly. We had opportunity to see some family members yesterday who I had not seen in years. And I got to know them a little bit better because I learned something new about them. And that happens when we talk about our God too. The more we interact with Him, the more that we learn about Him, see how He is working, see how He's working in our lives, the better we know Him. And like I said, we want to talk about knowing God through encountering His glory. I mentioned before that I did a lesson. I've already done the first part of this lesson. I'm going to go through it quickly, sort of roll over a review of it. And I was reading the rest of the lesson. Truthfully, it took me 30 minutes to figure out, did I do the second part? I don't know if I did the second part. Did I do the second part? So if I did, just ignore me, and we'll just keep going next week. But we read a section out of 1 Kings talking about Elijah. Elijah was discouraged. He'd run to a cave. He was complaining to God that he was the only one left. And then God shows up and says, "You're not the only one left." He shows up. You have the great wind, the earthquake, the fire, and then you have a low whisper. And then God passes in front of the cave. Elijah got to see God's glory a little bit clearer than he had seen it before. And in that, we pointed out that the Lord wants people to pay attention when He speaks. Also, we talked about how God doesn't just show up in the ways we expect Him to show up. When He shows up, it's in how He chooses and in ways that we aren't necessarily looking for. Whenever God speaks, we also saw that we need to be ready to accept what He says. And we also saw that to know God, we must pay attention and hear what He says. Talked a little bit about the presence of the Lord. Is that when the Lord is present, the response was worship. We looked at a couple of examples out of Exodus, I believe, that God's glory showed up and the people came to the door of their tents, and their first reaction, their only response was to bow down and worship because God's glory was present. Today, I want to start with Exodus chapter 33, and I'm going to read this section. It's going to be a few minutes before we get back to this section because I've got several other scriptures I want to read associated with it, but we're going to read Exodus chapter 33, starting at verse 12. Exodus 33, verse 12. Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people." And he said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And he said to him, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "This very thing that you have spoken I will do. For you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." Moses said, "Please show me your glory." And he said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy to whom I will show mercy." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." And the Lord said, Behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. And he goes on from there. Unfortunately, at least in my mind, he doesn't go to describe anything else. He just has this interaction between Moses and God, and it just stops. And I'm making the assumption that this is what happened afterwards, is that Moses was put in the cleft of the rock. God covers him. He removes his hand as he goes by and allowed Moses to see his glory. You know, when we start talking about this, I know we're familiar with a lot of these scriptures, but my purpose is not really for us to discover something new, but if that happens, that's great. But my purpose is to remind us and help add some color to what we already know. Add some color to what we already know. As with any subject concerning God, our minds can get stuck and have trouble processing. Especially think this, for me, when we talk about God's glory, it's something sort of nebulous. I have a hard time grasping onto it. And it's my mind works a whole lot like the computer I have in my living room. I was too cheap to buy a good computer, so I bought a bad computer. And this bad computer does not work. It takes forever to turn on. If it gets stuck on something, it'll stay there for an hour. It just will not move. Unfortunately, my mind works that way sometimes when we're talking about different subjects, especially when we start talking about God and how big of a subject He is. My mind gets stuck, and it just seems like it just spins and spins and spins and spins. I don't make any progress. I definitely am not able to do anything useful, but my mind just spins. So as we talk about God's glory, I'm afraid this can happen. Our minds simply can't process everything. And I'd like for us to at least crack the door on the subject and let us see a little more than we have in the past. So, as I mentioned, this is a hard subject for me. One of the reasons I wanted to teach on it is because I think it's a fascinating subject, and it's something I struggle with, but you will see that in my scripture wandering today as we go through. I've tried to concentrate it down to keep it to certain subjects, but we're going to start off with 3 or 4 scriptures in a row. And the reason I'm going to read all these are all different contexts, different scriptures, but they all have to do with God's glory. And I have a couple of questions for you as you, I'm going to ask you at the end, but I'll give them to you right now so let you be thinking about them. Is how do you describe God's glory? And then I want to look at the impressions that you get from these scriptures. What impressions of God do you get as we read these? So we're going to start with the first one, Exodus chapter 40. Again, we're going to come back to chapter 33 in a few minutes, but Exodus chapter 40. Starting at verse 34. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. This is sort of astounding because how long did they journey? 40 years. 40 years. God's glory was visible to them as they were journeying and when they were stopped. Next one, we're going to turn over to the New Testament, Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9. Starting at verse 3, it's an account of Paul telling about his conversion. Acts chapter 9, verse 3, it says, "Now, as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And he said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do.' The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And he was there for 3 days. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank." So it's interesting in this example that Saul is the only one that sees something. And Luke points that out to us. The others heard, but they didn't see. So he saw God's glory. He saw Jesus. And we all know what happened afterwards. It changed him. Changed him. One more scripture. Let's go to Matthew chapter 17. Matthew chapter 17. Starting at verse 1. "And after 6 days, Jesus took him, Peter and James and John and his brother, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun. His clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, 'Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And the voice from the cloud said, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him.' When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, 'Rise and have no fear.' And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus." They saw no one but Jesus. I like how Matthew ends that section. They saw no one but Jesus. If we could only just see no one but Jesus, how much better we would be as disciples, how much closer we'd walk to the Father. But we've been reading about God's glory. So when we talk about God's glory, what are some impressions that you have, maybe even before we read these scriptures, or maybe some impressions from these scriptures that we can know about God, that we can learn more about him?
This is easy. I gave you the questions up front, so we're ready to go now. Compassionate. Well, why? What?
He's caring for his people.
Okay, he's caring for
His
people.
hand is over them.
Very good. Yes. I have to talk to Dennis. Maybe he can water down the coffee for me or something.
I just think back to Moses coming out of Exodus, it's interesting just to think about that. So consistency is where my mind went.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
it started off on how truly you think about it, that Egypt not only allowed them to leave, but just poured riches on them as they're leaving, right? So that can't be a human plan with that. But then you get in there, then they run into, the block by water, right? And then they get through that, but then they get thirsty. It's just interesting on how, comments, oh, we would have been better off being slaves. It just, but the plan continued. God's plan, there's some adversity that comes on, and so we let doubt take over, but he continues. He's the same God that delivered them from Egypt, that delivered them through, the Red Sea, that delivered them through.
Yes.
But that doubt comes in. So I just like to think back to that consistency.
Okay.
That he has the power to continue through all of those things.
Right.
And when he's just said, my presence is there, you just can't help but be able to focus on that. Kind of the way the the disciples that they just saw Jesus only. It's just, we get so distracted. We see so many other things that you're right, that vision, that back to that, right? It's powerful.
Yeah.
I
Thank you. That's great because
I've got one. We're going to touch on this later too, but talking about the children of Israel, God's glory was present the entire time. Question was whether they saw it or not. Were they willing to look up and see that? And we can see through their story, which I think reflects a lot of our story, how they had doubt, like you said, and they turned away and they didn't see it, although it was there. It didn't quit being there, but they still struggled to refocus on it. Focus on. Very good. Thank you. Anyone else?
Seemed like there was some physical component to it, though. There's always a mention of a cloud and then a light so bright that some could see it.
Right.
There was something that he reason it covered Moses' eyes. Something, that your eyes could have seen. There.
no,
You're definitely right.
yes.
Uh,
A lot of what the majority of what we do in our faith, it's about faith, it's not seeing. But in these
instances, it was something that was visible, and that's at the next point we're going to talk about. That is, God's glory is visible. It was visible in these instances, and it's visible to us as well in our lives. Very good, thank you, Melissa.
Build our confidence. You think it would have built the Israelites' confidence that, by night there's this pillar of fire, whatever that is, it had to be magnificent. Just to be there every night. And then during the day, it would turn to a cloud and then lead them or just stay wherever it needed to be. And I guess, I want to say, stupid Israelites. It's right there. That power is right there in front of me today. Where's our confidence? When as you're about to probably go over it, we see it today, and yet we don't see it today.
No, that's a great point, Craig, because that's the first thing I want to do is say, why couldn't they just see this? And I think back on it, and I think these are great. The reason they're given to us is
The reason that God gave them to us is because we just fall into the same traps, don't we?
So what's the difference? I might be going down a rabbit hole. So here I'm the apostles are the ones that were taken up on the hill. They're scared to death. They won't even look up. They've gone into the fetal position on the ground. They can look up. And then their experience with Jesus, and then seeing the empty tomb, and then seeing Jesus after the empty tomb, they didn't waver from that point forward. How can I get to that point?
great question.
And that's, I guess that's the whole thing is get to the point where I will not waver from this point to the end of my life, and I'm that confident in the power of my God.
Right. Well, that's a great question. We can spend a whole other quarter on that.
That's a good lesson for you to come up with the next quarter. No, but it's a great question because it's as we're talking about God's glory and knowing Him better, we see how other people fail at it. But I think what I would like for us to do is to think about our own lives and how we can know God better, because that's the goal, isn't it? Is for us to know God better, to grow closer to Him, become more like Jesus in our life, and like you said, Craig, get to that point where it doesn't matter what happens. I'm not going to waver, and that's always a challenge. It's always a challenge. One thing, as Craig, you pointed out, these people saw the glory of God every day. I think we take for granted the things that we see, that we experience. We get used to it, don't we? And then we quit thinking about it. That's what
Experience to us sounds so majestic, and yet for them, over a period of 40 years, became commonplace.
Yes. Very good. Yes. Yeah.
Well, we're going to go back to Exodus 33, Exodus 33. But the first point I want to look at from there is that God, the glory of God is visible. The glory of God is visible. I'd love to use it. I'm going to use a verse that we all know. We all have heard it many times. Psalm chapter 19, verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork." God's glory is always present, not just when I'm looking for it and when I see it. I have an example. The sun outside. The sun doesn't change. It's always there. But it's shielded from us from part of the day, isn't it? There's part of the day we just don't see it. But does that mean it doesn't exist during that part of the day? No, it's still there. It continues to give the same amount of energy. It continues to give the same amount of warmth. It's just shielded and obscured from me. And I think some of the times in our life, our circumstances, or even our thinking obscures God's glory, which continues to be there all the time. One day, all those obstructions will be taken away, and we'll see it full time when we're with Him in heaven, won't we? But until then, there's a lot of obstructions, a lot of things that keep us from seeing God's glory. It's also like light. God's glory is just like light. It's hard to grasp it. It's hard to hold on to it, but we see it. And it makes things in our life look different. It makes our surroundings look different if we're keeping an eye on God's glory. Keep an eye on God's glory. So it's visible. So the next question I have for you all is, how does seeing God's glory help us know Him better? How does it help us know Him better? And,
His presence.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Go ahead.
go ahead, Greg.
Hey, Mike, like you said at the beginning of the class, sometimes we get stuck in this loop, and this happens to me it seems like all the time. Every time I try to think about it, I just grasp God's the size and just his absolute power and just being, the most supreme being ever, and just like the fact that he's eternal and just all those things, you just get overwhelmed, and you have to you just walk away and your thoughts move on to something else because it's beyond us. And so those things, they always feel that curiosity, within us. And about a year ago, I started getting into some hobby astronomy, just backyard stuff, and nothing too advanced. But that was something I always had an interest in, but just never kind of took it up. And so, through the process of doing this, I've done a lot of reading and just kind of researching and just trying to understand what I'm looking at inside. And wow, I mean, that is just absolutely mind-blowing when you see some of these things and you're just like, this was always there, and it was there way before I even was a thought, and just to take it all in, it's overwhelming. And when you see these things, it makes you want to know more. And but what it really does is it brings into focus how big our God is. And
Yeah.
and kind of like you try to put things in perspective. So like one of the things I learned was our galaxy, if you're trying to put it to a scale where we could like understand it, if you made our galaxy, Milky Way galaxy, the size of a grain of sand, the known universe that they've been able to detect through mathematics and just like scopes and stuff would be the size of the Empire State Building. So our galaxy is the size of a grain of sand. And our God made that with his own words. The Bible doesn't say that he toiled and labored for centuries or years or millennium trying to make it. He said that he spoke it and it became. And that's amazing.
Yeah. That is a great point, Greg.
And I wouldn't want to worship any other God, honestly, but, just to be blunt, I'm glad he's that big that we can't understand him all.
Yeah. And this goes back to a lot of what we mentioned
Before as well, Greg, because there's so much maybe that was why the Israelites had trouble with it. They were seeing it every day. They got stuck in the loop. They tried to grasp it, they couldn't, so they quit. That's a great thoughts on that. Yeah. Did I see somebody else's hand? Nope. Okay. How does seeing His glory help us know Him better? This goes along with what Greg mentioned. It helps us better grasp our place or our role in this life when we see His glory. We understand better. It recenters us to understand that we're not the sinner. He is. And when we see His glory, I think we're seeing a part of Him. It reveals a spiritual reality that gives us confidence of who our God is. God's glory shows and is connected with His holiness as you go through Scripture. And I'm not going to jump off into that deep subject right now, but God's presence. God is holy. He is set apart above all. And His glory shows that. I think also in God's presence there's freedom. We have freedom from self-rule, freedom from self-guidance, freedom from self-centeredness. And it only comes when we are concentrated and we are looking towards Him. We know Him better. Something else I would like us to look at back in chapter 33, Exodus 33, is that the more we see of His glory, the better we know Him. Now, I've stated this one before, but let's go to verse 20 and 23 in chapter 33. And the first thing we see that He limits how much of His glory we see because our finite minds can really only see or perceive so much. First of all, He limits it. Look at verse 20 and 23. Verse 20 says, "But He said, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." Then look down at verse 23. "Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." God, in some ways, limited Moses as far as what he could see or not see. He didn't give us a reason. I imagine, at least in my little mind, it's that if we had a full view of His glory, it may just make my mind explode because I just can't grasp it well enough. But for some reason, in this particular instance, He limited how much Moses could see. So God was a limiting factor, but also we are limiting factors to seeing God's glory. To see more glory, we have to widen our perspective, our experience with Him, and our field of view. We have to change who we are so that we can see more. First time I experienced this, I was with my uncle. So I've only been deer hunting once. And my uncle invited me to go, and he gave my cousin and my friend the best deer blind, and he's like, "Come with me." So in the dark, we're wandering around down to the bottom of the field. He gets under this tree. I'm excited. I'm ready to go. We're deer hunting. It's still dark. What does my uncle do? He lays back and goes to sleep. A couple hours later, he wakes up, and he sits straight up, and he says, "There's 3 deer right there. And there's a buck that's going to follow him." I was like, "I can't see anything. What are you talking about?" But sure enough, after a little bit of time, I was able to see that. But he had trained himself to see certain things. I had limited my vision. His perspective was a little bit wider open. And when we talk about God, I think a lot of times we do that. We just haven't learned to look for these things. We haven't experienced the things that maybe we need to sort of widen what we think. I think it happens all the time when we start talking about religious subjects. Sometimes we get afraid to talk with someone else who goes to a different church because I'm afraid of what they might say. I learned this when I was in Hungary, talking with people who didn't have any background in religion. I started asking them questions about God and what they viewed about God. And if you're offended easily, you don't ask those sort of questions because they're going to tell you. These people would tell you straight up. And I'd had people give me just all sorts of range of opinions and views of God, and sometimes it hurt my feelings. But we kept going. But you learn how to widen your perspective. You learn how to see things and not be such a limiting factor. Another example is that when you got to know your spouse or a friend, the first time that you met your spouse, how much did you know about them after that first meeting? You really didn't know that much, did you? After I got married, I still didn't know that much. After 15 years, I knew a little bit more, but not much more. And then now at 28 years, I know a little bit more, but I think she's still holding out something that I just don't know. I don't know yet. But our relationship with God, our seeing God and knowing Him better, first impressions are important, but that's not everything because we still need to grow in our knowledge, grow in our understanding. The more we see of His glory, the better we know Him. Going back to chapter 33, verse 13. He says in verse 13, "Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight, and consider too that this nation is your people." Seeing God's ways and walking in them causes us to know Him better. Causes us to know Him better. There's a couple of verses in Psalms. Psalms chapter 25, verse 4 is the first one. Psalms 25, verse 4. He says, Make me to know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Psalm 25, 4. Make me to know your ways, O Lord, and teach me your paths. Psalm 119, verse 15. 119, verse 15. It says, I will meditate on your precepts and fix my eyes on your ways. On your ways. Can someone paraphrase for me what this means to you, or what comes to mind when we talk about God's ways? Because this phrase is used several times throughout the Bible. And here are just two examples. What does it mean to follow God's ways, to be in God, to do God's things, to be in His ways?
Well, I think it means you need to take it upon yourself
Okay.
to do things.
Okay.
I got a fortune cookie last night. It said, what did it say? It said, the man that doesn't need a boss, or the person that doesn't need a boss, is often chosen to be one. And you think about that, and that we understand what they're talking about.
Right.
And I translate that into getting to know God better. We don't need somebody to always be like you, telling us to get to know God better.
Right.
We need you right now to do this because it needs to implant in us the desire.
Good.
We just have to have the desire.
I chuckle because my sons love those fortune cookies, and they always try to find the literal meaning in their lives. What does this mean?
Well, usually they turn into mush, but finally I got one last night. I thought, I don't understand what he's talking
The best one we got one day was after one of them got one about another child being added to our family. Lisa's But yeah, God's ways. You're right. You're right. And
That's exactly right. It's something that we desperately need to get to that point where that comes from within us, doesn't it? That we want to follow God's ways, that we want to seek His ways. Someone else, what does that phrase come to mind? What, if you could paraphrase what it means to be God's ways?
Well, my first thought is what a contrast, and that it's my ways. I just think that's when I go back and read the 25 verse 4 again. the your just jumps out there so much, because I think that's the challenge, is that I think I have the way laid out. It's this path, that makes sense. And so once again, it's that being able, knowing what the battle you are facing, because when it says your ways, I think this was written thinking of your individual earthly ways of what it is. So that's what jumps out to me.
Excellent.
On whose path and whose ways do you really need to be focused on?
And
Donnie, I really wish you wouldn't have brought that back up, because it seems like the majority of what we learn in the Bible is about that, and it's about Him, and it's not about us. It's not about me and what I want. And that's something that's really hard to get past. Start off as children, it's hard to get past as a child. When you get older, it's still hard to get past. But it's something that we have to be able to, at least some of the time, struggle to get past, so that we can become more like Him and put His ways first.
Where it says God's ways are not man's ways. I get frustrated because I'm being asked to think in God's, or try to think in God's mind, but I'm human. God, you made me human, but yet you want me to know your ways. But your ways are not my ways, because I'm human, and it's a quandary that sometimes frustrates me. Your ways are hidden from me, but yet you want me to know your ways. So there's a bit of frustration out there.
no, I think it's pretty described.
Basically, the struggle we have as God's people, isn't it? Because that is the struggle for us to see things from His point of view, us to see people the way He sees them. And I guess without struggle, there isn't growth, is there? One more scripture I want to read on this section, and then we're going to move on. Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 17. Deuteronomy 26.
17. Deuteronomy 26:17 says, "You have
Declare today that the Lord is your God, and that you will walk in His ways, and keep His statutes, and His commandments, and His rules, and will obey His voice." Moses connects there God's ways with His commandments, with His statutes, with His rules, and then he says with obeying Him. So a lot of what we discussed already is sort of summed up in this, is that to stay in God's ways means to do it His way, right? It means to follow Him and to obey what He says. The more we see His actions and His habits, the more we understand His steps. The more we walk in His paths and see His ways, the better we know Him. The better we know Him. So going back to Exodus 33, 2 or 3 more quick points to finish up. 33 verse 16.
For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not you're going with us so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? The presence of the Lord makes us distinct. Makes us distinct. I need a lot of help sometimes understanding some of these words, so I go to the dictionary quite often. And I purposely don't go to the biblical dictionary because I'm curious what the regular dictionary says about it. And it says distinct is something that is different in nature from something else. Readily distinguishable by our senses. By being in God's presence, we become distinct, readily distinguishable by others. Our distinction is derived from God first, and then derived from us in as much as we are becoming like Him. Inasmuch as we are becoming like Him. A couple of scriptures. First one, very familiar, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10.
I have to admit, I have a hard time reading this on my own because I get stuck. I can't go very far. It has so much stuff in it. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, it says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Peter says that we are in Christ, we are distinct. And we are distinct because of Christ's blood. We're distinct because of God's presence. We are distinct because of who we belong to. Not necessarily who we are, who we belong to. There's another scripture, Acts chapter 4, verse 13. I've read this one before for you, I believe. After Jesus' resurrection, the apostles are teaching and preaching, and they were being very bold about it, and they were always brought before the Jewish councils and the Jewish leaders. And in chapter 4, verse 13, it says, now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated, common men, they were astonished. They recognized that they had been with Jesus. Their time in his presence had made them distinct. And the same thing happens with us. Our time in his presence makes us distinct. It makes us who we are. It makes us distinct from the world. It makes us his people. Without being in his presence, we shouldn't move forward. So chapter 33, verse 15. And he said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. Moses has an attitude here I think I would do a whole lot better off having in my life. The one that I'm not willing to go forward if the Lord isn't going with me. Maybe this is why waiting on the Lord is such an important topic we see throughout the Bible. Waiting on the Lord so that he can go with us. There's several scriptures I can read on this. I'll just read one. Psalm chapter 27, verse 14. Psalm 27, 14. It says, wait for the Lord. Be strong. Let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Wait for the Lord. Moses wasn't willing to move without the Lord. And in this section we read in chapter 33, he argues back and forth. He goes back and forth with God about this. He's like, I'm not moving unless you go with us. I'm going to stay right here unless you go with us. He was waiting on the Lord. He wanted God's presence with them.